Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, thanks for being here. I'd like to talk about human trafficking, one of the great scourges of our time. There are more slaves on Earth now than at any point in human history. Thank you for the work of the Bureau in the Jeffrey Epstein case. That monster is in the process of being brought to justice, and your agents have done good work in that regard. Let's zoom back out from an individual case, though, to the bigger picture. When is it appropriate for trafficking cases to be investigated by state and local and highway patrol versus the Bureau? How do you divide the responsibilities?
Well, as a general rule, we take the approach with human trafficking that we do with most threats where there's overlapping responsibility, which is we look at where we at the FBI can most add value to the common fight against whatever the threat is. And so in the case of human trafficking, we probably spend more of our efforts on the FBI side focused on sex trafficking and sex trafficking of kids than, for example, on labor trafficking of adults. Doesn't mean we don't investigate the others, but we try to work with other agencies to try to share the load. But where we think we can most add value is on going after those who traffic kids for sex. And we have extensive investigations. In fact, just this month, ongoing, we have something called Operation Independence Day. And I think at last count, about halfway through the month, we'd already rescued or recovered about 40 kids just this month. It's ongoing. It will end at the end of the month. Part of the reason I make that distinction is because there are skill sets we can provide and offer that I think are uniquely relevant to dealing with child victims, for example. There are authorities that we have that help us investigate more effectively some of the online effectiveness that some of the traffickers have. And so those are some of the ways I think we contribute uniquely, but it's very much of a common fight. We have task forces all over the country. I think about 85 child exploitation and human trafficking task forces that have partners, and I mentioned in my opening statement how much we rely on state and local law enforcement. Lots and lots and lots of state and local law enforcement officers are on those task forces all over the country, so we really do try to go at it together.
There are great task forces in the Bureau and at state and local levels as well. The Nebraska Attorney General, Doug Peterson, has stood up a task force that's very impressive. Creighton University in Omaha has a bunch of researchers who've been studying the moving of brothels that have kids in them, and average brothel size that they've studied often has 3 to 5 kids, and they move around connected to sporting events. But again, praising the work, because there's clearly new focus at the Bureau on this, so this is not retrospective critical, but forward-looking. I'm skeptical that we have nearly enough resources on this problem when we know that tens of thousands of kids are marketed online any given month, and a lot of these brothels with 3 to 5 kids move by sporting event. They're crossing state lines. Do you think that we have enough resources in the Bureau dedicated to child sex trafficking?
Well, we're devoting a lot of resources to it, but I will tell you that any additional resources Congress would see fit to give us, I can assure you will be put to good use. It is absolutely horrifying that in the 21st century, this kind of activity can happen in our country. I mean, it's borderline medieval. And some of these kids are just heartbreakingly young and utterly helpless. And so the more resources we can bring to the fight, both on the federal side, but also state and local law enforcement, but also, frankly, we work very closely with NGOs and various other forms of organizations to try to help prevent some of this activity. There's a big role for awareness raising in this space as well from a prevention perspective, because while on the one hand, I'm thrilled when we recover a child, on the other hand, I'm realist and heartbroken because I know that kid will never be the same.
There's a lot of estimates that somewhere around a majority, we don't use the term child prostitution anymore because it's not a crime that has consent in it, so we use the term child rape, but of the broad category of prostitution, the assumption is that probably a majority of prostitution in the U.S. involves people under 21. And of those over 21, some large share of them were trafficked into this before they were 21. So we call it medieval, but it does seem like it's a particularly pernicious modern scourge because the numbers seem greater now than at any point in history. Do we have a national strategy to combat it? And if so, who's in charge of it?
Well, I know that we work very collaboratively with a whole host of other agencies in the federal government, for example, ranging from the Department of Labor to the Department of State, because there's a huge role there. To the Department of Health and Human Services. I can remember specific meetings I've been to with other cabinet secretaries specifically focused on human trafficking. So it's clearly one of these things that is a multidisciplinary problem requiring a multidisciplinary approach, and I think that's what the administration is bringing to it.
I only have a little bit of time left, but I want to set up a set of questions for you that I'll follow up with you on later and or for the record. But following on your answers to Senator Cornyn about IP theft and our counterintelligence efforts against the Chinese in the U.S. and the places where there is so much intellectual property being stolen, if you were able to give the sort of elevator pitch to a bunch of folks in Silicon Valley about what the Chinese strategy is when they deal with them, Senator Cornyn used the example of those of us on the Intelligence Committee who've had conversations with tech CEOs who believe because people are given visas into the US, they've already been vetted. Obviously, that's not the case, and these are regular assets of the Chinese government. And I appreciate the distinctions you wanted to collapse between Chinese nominally private sector institutions and the government, and the distinction between the government and the Communist Party as being distinctions regularly without a difference. If you were explaining your elevator pitch to Silicon Valley CEOs when they're approached by Chinese investors, and by Chinese computer scientists, what's the shorthand of the way you would try to put them on notice about how IP theft is organized from Beijing?
Well, I think you can look at, for example, the various 5-year plans the Chinese have for technologies that they're seeking to achieve dominance in. And then you can look at some of the cases that we've brought, which I think raise awareness. And what you know is that either through lawful means, joint ventures, foreign investment, et cetera, or in some cases just out-and-out criminal means, IP theft, cyber intrusions, et cetera, they are determined to push themselves up the economic ladder at other people's expense, at the U.S. And our partners' expense. And so I think anybody, whether it's in a Silicon Valley startup or a Fortune 100 company, needs to be clear-eyed and thoughtful about who they get into business with, because the road is long with victims of this. And a lot of those companies wish they could get it back. I think there's a company that I remember in Massachusetts that went down this road and then saw, once they had gotten too far in, saw its stock drop 40-something% in one day. Because once they were finished with them, they moved on. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't do business with the Chinese. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have Chinese visitors. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try to coexist with China as a country on the world stage. But it does mean that there are certain kinds of behavior that violates criminal laws. And we're not going to tolerate it. And it doesn't matter whether it's Chinese or anybody else. We're going to hold people accountable. And I don't really care what some foreign government has to say about it.
Thank you.